The hallway outside the post office felt narrower than usual, the kind of narrow that made every sound bounce twice before settling. Walt stepped in from the cold, brushing a sleeve against the melting flakes on his jacket, and took his place behind a short line of people waiting for the records counter. The bright overhead lights washed the tiled floor in a pale glaze, and the little number machine let out a ding that seemed louder than it needed to be. "Sir." "That lane is for staff only," Jacob called out from behind the small glass window. It wasn't rude exactly, just sharp enough to turn a few heads. People shifted, curious, maybe a little impatient. Walt paused, reading the temporary signs taped along the wall, then took a quiet step back into the public lane. A couple of folks behind him edged forward, as if nudged by nothing more than the mood in the room. Walt didn't stumble, but the social pressure made him ease half a step to the side. He lowered his gaze, steadying his breath the way he'd learned years ago. "Just trying to help you find the right place," Jacob added loud enough to carry. Walt nodded once. "Appreciate it." "That line's for outgoing mail." "Not records," Jacob said again, already turning to the next person. Walt stayed where he was, calm and unmoving. The hallway hummed with fluorescent lights, and someone's winter coat rustled as they adjusted their bag. The cold he'd carried in was fading, but a thin draft still crept along the floor tiles. A young woman glanced at him, then away. "Happens to all of us," she murmured, though her tone suggested she didn't fully believe it. Walt gave a small smile. "Sure does." Another ding sounded. People shifted again. Someone cleared their throat. It was all small stuff, barely anything at all, but stacked together it pressed on Walt like a polite, invisible shoulder. He let his hand fall naturally to his side thumb, brushing the edge of the coin in his palm. A small silver piece worn smooth from years of carrying it. He didn't lift it, didn't show it, just held it as if the weight steadied him. "Is he in the right line now?" someone whispered. Jacob shrugged without looking. "He'll get there." Walt kept his eyes on the counter. The smell of paper envelopes and cardboard boxes drifted out each time the inner door opened. A man ahead of him adjusted his cap and stepped closer to the front. Then the line hesitated. Just a second. Just long enough for Walt to look up. But Walt didn't move from the spot just yet. Jacob watched Walt from the counter window, the way someone watches a problem they think is about to form. He leaned slightly forward, voice carrying just enough. "Sir, if there's an issue with the line, you can speak to me directly." Walt shook his head. No issue. But Jacob had already decided there was. "You were in the wrong lane earlier. Just making sure we're clear." An older couple in matching winter coats exchanged a tiny glance. "Rules are rules," the woman murmured, not unkindly, just certain. Walt let the words pass. The warm yellow light overhead caught the edge of his glasses, softening his expression into something almost gentle. He shifted his hand, and for a moment a sliver of silver coin peeked from his palm before he tucked it back again. Evan, stacking envelopes at the side counter, noticed the glint. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly, not accusatory, curious. The coin didn't look like loose change. It had weight to it, even from across the hall. "Sir, you sure you're in the right place?" Jacob pressed, still misreading Walt's calm for stubbornness. Walt nodded once. "Didn't mean trouble." People shuffled forward as the number board chirped another ding. The line moved in slow breaths, winter boots scraping softly against tile. A few glanced at Walt as if waiting for him to say something more, but he kept still, hands steady, breath even. Still, he didn't react with anything sharp. It wasn't his way. The overhead lights flickered briefly, throwing a gold sheen across the polished floor. The sound of sorting machines thumped faintly behind the inner wall, steady and rhythmic. Evan kept watching Walt's hand the way his thumb stayed pressed against the coin's face like he was keeping a memory in place. A man farther up cleared his throat and stepped forward. Next, Jacob called, though his eyes were still pinned on Walt. Walt shifted slightly to let the older couple pass, offering them a polite nod. They nodded back, unsure but softened by his quiet composure. The line stretched behind him now, people adjusting bags and rubbing hands together against the lingering cold. Evan hesitated at his station, glancing from Walt to Jacob, then back again. Something about the entire moment felt tilted like a picture frame hung just a little off-center. Then Evan stepped a little closer. Jacob's voice carried farther than he meant it to, bouncing off the narrow walls as another cluster of people joined the line. "Let's keep things orderly, please. Some folks are having trouble with the lanes today." He didn't look at Walt when he said it, but everyone else did. A few brows lifted. Someone shifted their bag. A quiet ripple of misunderstanding moved through the hallway, subtle but unmistakable. Walt stood with the same calm as before, gaze lowered, thumb brushing the surface of the coin in his palm. The warm light overhead gleamed along his glasses again, softening the lines of his face. Evan stepped nearer, finally close enough to speak without raising his voice. "Sir, is that a special coin?" Walt didn't answer right away. The line crept forward. Another foot boots scraping on tile, the faint hum of mail sorters pulsing behind the wall. A woman near the back frowned, whispering to her companion. Someone should help him. The tone carried worry, not irritation, but it only added to the confusion. Evan's eyes stayed on the small silver curve visible between Walt's fingers. "I've seen you before," he said. "You sit out on your porch swing on Sundays reading old letters." Walt gave a tiny nod. "Helps pass the time. My dad used to do that." Evan continued. "Said the porch was the best place to hear your own thoughts." "That's true enough." Walt replied, his voice worn but gentle. The line paused as the number board dinged again. People shuffled, adjusting scarves, tapping gloves against their coats. Jacob called, "Next, please," still speaking with that clipped tone that kept everyone slightly on edge. A teenage boy leaned toward his mother. "Why is he just standing there?" "Hush," she whispered. "Maybe he needs directions." Walt didn't react. He wasn't sure how to react without turning the moment into something heavier. The coin in his hand warmed under his grip, familiar steadying. He focused on it, on the years pressed into its surface, on the names it held. Still, he said nothing more. Evan looked toward Jacob, then toward the people, whispering, then back at Walt. The pressure in the hallway had changed, more eyes, more assumptions, more waiting. It felt like the whole place was tilting toward a misunderstanding no one meant to create. "You know," Evan said a little louder so the nearest folks could hear Mr. Hensley, "here always holds that coin the same way. I've delivered mail to his street for years. He's never been anything but kind." A small hush passed over the front of the line. No one stepped back, but they stopped, inching forward. Walt exhaled slow. He hadn't wanted attention. He hadn't wanted anything really except to pick up his records envelope and keep his day simple. But the eyes on him felt heavier now, not mean, just confused. Behind the window, Jacob frowned. "Look, I'm just trying to keep order. I didn't say anything was wrong." "You didn't have to," someone muttered. Walt shook his head lightly. "No harm done." But the hallway felt tight enough to press the breath out of him. He closed his hand around the coin, again, knuckles whitening, just a shade as memories crowded, close voices from years ago, faces he carried like imprints on the metal. The number board dinged once more, long and bright. People waited to move, but no one did. Walt stepped forward at last. Evan matched his pace for a few steps, then slowed. Something in the air shifted an instinct, a realization, a pause that didn't feel accidental, and Evan suddenly stopped walking. Evan didn't even wait for the next number to be called. The moment the tension in the hallway broke enough for him to slip away, he jogged out into the cold breath fogging in the late afternoon air. His house was only a few blocks from the post office, a narrow place with a porch lined in old flower pots. He ducked inside, rifling through a drawer in the entryway until he found it an old clipping, yellowed at the edges, taped long ago to a cardboard backing. Local mailman rescues child during '89 storm. He remembered the story well. His uncle never forgot it. The man in the article had looked younger then, but the eyes were unmistakable. Evan slid the clipping into his jacket and hurried back. By the time he returned, Walt had stepped out of the line and crossed to the small cafe next door. He sat at a corner table, the one closest to the window, a cup of plain coffee cooling in front of him. The late-day sun slanted through the glass, painting soft amber squares across the wooden table. Walt kept one hand curled around the coin, turning it once, then letting it rest. Jacob entered the cafe moments later. He scanned the room before spotting Walt, his expression tight, with the kind of resolve people use when they think they're about to fix something. He walked over slowly, clearing his throat. Sir Jacob said, standing across from the table, I wanted to address what happened. There were procedures. It wasn't personal. Walt nodded, offering nothing more. Jacob shifted his weight. You stepped into the staff lane earlier, and we have to maintain order. Folks get confused. Walt said quietly, I understand. But Jacob felt every rule in the building pressing on his shoulders, the way protocol could push a man back without ever touching him. It made his breath hitch for a moment, as though the words he'd practiced didn't quite sit right anymore. Evan stepped inside, then the bell over the door chiming softly. He held the faded clipping in both hands, knuckles tight around the edges. When he reached the table, he set it down gently between them. That's him, Evan said. My uncle told that story 100 times. Said a storm nearly took him, and a mailman carried him out of a flooded yard. Said he kept a coin in his pocket the whole time, this coin. The cafe fell quiet. Even the grinder behind the counter seemed to soften into the background. Walt didn't speak. He opened his hand instead. The coin lay in his palm, catching the low winter sun. A bright ring of light flashed across the tabletop. Jacob froze, and the two customers near the counter froze with him, as if the entire room had been dropped into a sudden hush. No one breathed, no one moved. Their eyes locked on the small, worn coin that gleamed like something rescued from another lifetime. They stood almost motionless when the light hit it full on. The shine revealed the unit mark etched long ago, faded in places, still sharp in others. Jacob recognized it before he even knew what he was looking at. That's a... He stopped himself, the words sticking in his throat. Walt rested the coin gently on the table, letting the sunlight settle around it. The wooden surface warmed under the glow, and dust motes drifted lazily in the bright stripe cutting through the room. Outside, a car rolled past, tires whispering on the cold pavement. Jacob swallowed, hands trembling slightly. Why didn't you say something? Walt looked at him with calm, steady eyes. Wasn't asked. The quiet settled again, deeper this time, as if the cafe itself wanted to listen. Jacob slowly reached for the coin. Jacob's hand hovered above the coin a moment longer. Then he drew it back, as if the weight of what he'd just seen settled into his chest. The cafe's soft clatter returned slowly, the steam wand sighing a spoon, tapping porcelain, the muted shuffle of winter coats. But the room's mood had changed. Even the quiet sounded different. Jacob cleared his throat. Mr. Marin, I judged you wrong. His voice was low, stripped of the sharpness it carried earlier. I'm sorry. Walt gave a small nod. No harm done. But Evan straightened a little. Actually, there was harm, he said gently. He saved my uncle in that storm back in '89. If he hadn't come along, my family would have lost him. He touched the corner of the old newspaper clipping on the table. People ought to know that. A murmur rippled through the cafe. Two women near the counter exchanged wide-eyed looks, whispering to each other before one stepped closer. Sir, were you really the one who carried that boy out? She asked. Walt shifted in his seat. Just did what I could. Another customer, a man with a knitted beanie pulled low over his ears, spoke up. I remember that storm. Took our barn roof. That was a long night. It was, Walt said softly. Evan glanced between them, warming to the moment. Town library still has a community board, right? My mom says mailmen know every secret in town. He grinned. Guess she was right. A few people chuckled, easing the last bit of tension from the air. Jacob pulled out the chair across from Walt and sat. There's something else, he said. Our library board's been emptying out old plaques and replacing them. He gestured at the coin. This story deserves a place there, if you're willing. Walt looked down at the coin, then at the faces waiting around him. He saw no judgment now, only sincerity, a quiet kind of respect that reminded him of mornings on his old route, when neighbors left apples on their porches or waved from driveways just because. You don't need to put anything up for me, he said. Maybe not, Evan answered, but folks should know the truth. You helped this town long before any of us were old enough to notice. The barista wiping down the counter chimed in. We could use stories like that these days. Makes the place feel like home. Walt's gaze softened. Outside the window, evening crept in, tinting the streetlights with a warm halo. Snowflakes wandered down in slow spirals. Jacob leaned forward. Let us do this. I think people will want to see your name up there. Walt didn't speak for a long moment, letting the ambient cafe sounds fill the space between them, the soft scraping of chairs, the gentle hum of conversation, the aroma of coffee drifting like a warm blanket across the tables. Finally, he nodded. If it helps the town, he said, then all right. One of the women near the counter smiled. It'll remind people there's still goodness in small places. A man by the door added, and that kindness stays longer than we think. The group seemed to gather around that thought, letting it settle, letting it reshape the memory of the hallway and the misunderstandings that came before. They didn't need another speech. The room had already shifted. Anyway, folks had heard enough to change their minds. Snow fell in slow, unhurried flakes the next afternoon, drifting across the post office parking lot and settling in soft patches along the railings. Inside the corridor, lights glowed warm against the winter gray. Walt walked in quietly, hands tucked into his coat pockets, expecting nothing more than to pick up the envelope he'd come for the day before. But the hallway looked different. Along the left wall, just past the numbered ticket stand, a small brass plaque had been mounted at eye level. The metal gleamed under the soft yellow bulbs, catching the light, the way the old coin sometimes did in his palm. Etched into the surface was a simple image, a rendering of the coin's face, and beneath it a few lines about the '89 storm, the rescued boy and the mailman who never asked for thanks. Walt stopped. He didn't touch it, not at first. He just stood there listening to the shuffle of boots behind him, the hum of the heater, the familiar ding from the number machine. The plaque fit right into the space as if it had been waiting there for years. Evan appeared from the side counter, wiping his hands on a towel. Glad you came by, he said. Wanted you to see it before the afternoon crowd shows up. Walt nodded slowly. Didn't expect anything like this. We wanted folks to remember, Evan replied. And not just the storm. The way you carry that coin. It's part of who you are. People deserve to see the story behind it. A few customers glanced over, reading the plaque with quiet interest. One man smiled and tipped his cap at Walt. Another murmured to her daughter, pointing gently at the engraving. Evan cleared his throat and held out a small envelope. "This is from my uncle," he said. "He wrote it last night when I told him. Thought you should have it." Walt took the envelope carefully. Inside was a folded card with only a few words written in steady block letters. "You carried me once. I've carried that memory ever since. Thank you." He closed the card, sliding it back into the envelope with a slow breath. Evan leaned against the wall, looking at the plaque. Funny how people freeze for a second when they notice the small things, a patch, a coin, a piece of a man's life they never saw. The words hung in the warm air, settling gently between them. Walt looked again at the coin engraving, then slipped his hand into his pocket and brushed his thumb over the real one. The metal felt cool, familiar, steady, like a companion he hadn't known he needed until now. Beyond the glass doors, the snow thickened, catching the yellow street lamps in soft halos. A radio behind the counter started playing Silver Bells, the melody drifting through the corridor like a warm ribbon of sound. People moved a little slower, spoke a little softer, as if the plaque itself had nudged the day into a kinder shape. Walt stepped closer to the wall and finally let his fingers rest on the plaque's frame. Not long, just long enough to feel the warmth the metal had gathered from the lights. He turned back to Evan. "Thank you," he said simply. "You've done more for this town than most folks realize," Evan answered. "We're just catching up." Walt gave a soft smile, then buttoned his coat and walked toward the exit. The glass doors parted with a gentle sigh, letting in a curl of crisp evening air. The cold felt a little kinder that evening. If this story moved you, share it forward. Snow drifted along the post office corridor as Walt paused beside the new plaque, letting the warm hallway lights settle on the engraved coin that now carried his story for anyone willing to slow down and notice. Still, he slipped the real coin between his fingers the way a man might hold a small lamp in a winter window. Steady quiet meant less for himself than for whoever might need its glow. Then Evan's thank you card rested in his coat pocket, and the words inside echoed softly with the truth that kindness doesn't ask for a return. It simply keeps moving forward through the lives it touches. Quietly, as Walt stepped back into the cold, he understood how a single moment, like the way people freeze when they finally see a man, clearly can outlast the years and turn into something that lives on.